Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, where some folks are. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. I'm Kelly Bourne. I'm director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and an affiliate at Stanford Cyber Policy Center. And so we have been co-hosting these webinars together for some time now. And today's conversation is going to be on digital identification systems. And I think this is a really important conversation because identity plays such a critical role in people's ability to participate in digital economies. And estimates suggest that something like 60% of global GDP is going to be digital in the next couple of years. And this is in particular important because of the risks for exclusion here, or the challenges around inclusivity. We know that 40% of the world's population is still not online, and that without digital identification systems, women and those in low-income economies are particularly at risk of being left behind. So really glad to be joined today by a great group of experts. We have Anri Sinha, who is from India's Center for the Internet and Society, and he manages programs there on privacy, big data, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. We have Anri who is from the London School of Economics. She is a PhD researcher there and a doctoral fellow on Research ICT Africa's Digital New Deal project. And finally, Dr. Tom Fischer, who is a research officer with Privacy International and oversees all of their work on digital identification systems. So in just a minute, I'll turn to all of them, but first, just a little bit of background on the topic and why we wanted to take this on today. We know that something like 1 billion people lack basic identification credentials worldwide, and that this invisible billion live predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Hence the UN Sustainable Development Goals introducing a target 16.9, to provide legal identity for all, including birth registration by 2030. And so digital ID, I think, plays a critical role here. And there have been a number of benefits and risks. So I'll just quickly walk through those before turning to our guests here. So on the benefits side, people talk often about the benefits to people in the various roles that they play in their lives. So benefits to people as consumers when they are wanting to make purchases, when they're wanting to engage in the banking system online. Benefits to people as workers when they're seeking to receive payments, to entrepreneurs when they're looking to launch small businesses, to citizens when they're seeking government services, and to property owners when they are attempting to prove ownership. And this is particularly relevant for women. And in addition to the individual benefits, there have been estimates on the benefit to society and to economies as a whole, with a range of experts suggesting increases to GDP from digital ID anywhere from 3 to 13% of GDP, and this latter number being really relevant for lower income economies. So important individual and potential economic and societal benefits here. But at the same time, these are clearly dual use technologies. While there are a lot of benefits offered, there are also a number of potential risks and harms. I think the one discussed most often is probably the risk around inclusion and protection against discrimination, particularly in countries with a history of government-enforced ethnic, racial, or religious injustice. Also, a lot of concerns around security and potential data breaches, around privacy, around individual users' control of their own data and the potential for misuse, the kinds of scope creep and government surveillance that many have been concerned about. And then, of course, all kinds of concerns around technical systems failures, around vendor selection and locking in the wrong kinds of technology. So a lot of interesting points to discuss here. I want to turn, I think, Tom, I'll start with you and would love to hear just anything I'm missing on the risks and opportunities that I just laid out. And then also some examples. I know Privacy International has thought a lot about the impacts of these systems on marginalized people. So I'd love to see what you're observing there and any thoughts that you have on the kinds of issues that these systems are and aren't really suited for. Anri, I'd love to turn from there to you to see what you've observed with the rollout of digital ID in the global South, especially when we see this history of biometric and other forms of identification in different regions and regions that have a history of colonialism, and what you think about lessons learned from the deployment of other technologies or even the internet, and that we can learn here as we think about digital ID. And then Amber, would love to turn to you. I know India you're in India and you moved to digital ID something like 10 years ago, I believe. And I understand there's now well over 1 billion people using the system. It's the largest implementation anywhere in the world. And I know you all have done a lot of research on the role of digital identity when we think about digital governance more broadly, and a lot of work thinking about how do we assess whether these systems are actually producing the intended benefits and what kinds of tech and policy design considerations might influence that. So that is our plan, and then we'll save 30 minutes or so for Q&A. People in the audience can go ahead and enter questions as they arise while people are speaking in the chat box. Each of our panelists, if you have very specific answers to questions that are easy, go ahead and answer them. Otherwise, I will moderate those questions when we get to a little past the half-hour mark. And there's an up and down voting function. So if people are particularly interested in questions, go ahead and upvote those, and I will try and focus on those. But with that, would love, Tom, to turn to you, and thank you all for being here.
Hi, thanks very much for that intro. I think you covered many of the key kind of issues. I do just want to flag that, when it comes to proposed benefits, it can also have a very negative impact on these kind of same factors as well. And also, on the other hand, when we are looking at, say, the proposed increase to GDP, we have to interrogate quite closely where these figures are coming from. For instance, there's a lot of work done by management consultancies on this, who themselves are trying to sell the deployment of digital identity systems around the world, which leads to open questions to what extent we can, what extent we can trust these figures when they're from kind of these perspectives. But I just wanted to talk a bit about some of the examples around the world of some of these issues, because it has a huge impact. For instance, in Kenya, the government was taken to court over their new digital ID, the Huduma number, by the Nubian community, a group who'd been denied access to identity documents for generations, with the concern that these new digital systems only deepen their exclusion. And you can see this example going through in other issues in Kenya with people who have ended up on non-refugees who ended up on the UNHCR refugee databases, leaving them double registered and unable to access the key services in education and health there. In neighboring Uganda, there was recent research showing up to a third lacking access to the ID card that's needed for accessing essential services like healthcare and pensions, most deeply affected the elderly and women. And it's also important to flag that others might have access to digital ID, but faces challenges in using them. For instance, trans people, when trying to access, say, healthcare, we did some recent research at PI, my colleagues work in the Philippines, France, and Argentina, and when what you have written on your ID doesn't match how you present yourselves, the key challenges that forms for trans people. And I think we've also, the key worry here is we see so much function creep with these systems, both by design from government and states, but also when they are used for more and more things from the private sector. And things far beyond what they originally described as being for. I know that Anri very well aware in India, the CoWIN platform for accessing vaccinations for COVID needs a person to use their Aadhaar ID. And at the same time, Aadhaar being used to give people a new health ID and digitize health records. And we have to remember that digital IDs are perfect for building upon them these other pieces of digital infrastructure. So even when the ID itself, like Aadhaar, has kind of data minimization built into it, the whole system on which we placed upon it is really ripe for exploitation of people's data from and surveillance from what is then the broader digital infrastructure, which is also what we have to be careful about. So, the human rights consequences are huge because this need for digital ID expands to more and more aspects of people's lives. So a person's entire life, their health, employment, housing, even their ability to get married becomes tied to these kind of ability to get these identities. And just then the sheer impact of either not having one or not be able to get one is quite devastating on individuals and communities. And to touch upon something you mentioned in the introduction, I'm glad you touched upon this, that there's an assumption a lot of the time that these systems will work, when in fact, we're going to see failures. Tech will fail, biometrics fail for the elderly or manual workers, and there will be data breaches, because we're talking long term here with these systems. They have to be relevant for decades into the future. And similarly, the politics will fail. I mean, how many of us can be sure that the government will be elected in 30 years' time won't be one that abuses these systems to the detriment of certain communities? We saw this in New York, where the ID card designed to be inclusive of undocumented migrants. Then once Trump gets into power, suddenly this database takes a whole new set of risks involved with that. And I think, rather than having a list of do's or don'ts for use of digital ID, I mean, there are certain sets of concerns when we look into, say, the health sector, and once you get into, say, use of biometrics in particular linked to digital ID in those areas, that obviously raises huge concerns. But I think the issue here is we need to instead look at why the system is needed and what then is needed to have a ID system that meets those kind of needs. And I think the mistake in the policy discourse is to see there being one big problem, that people don't have ID. And I think that's what kind of invites a certain techno-solutionism and having this one big idea that will solve all society's problems. I think we have to look at rather this as 1,000 smaller policy issues. An issue like some kids can't have education because they can't prove their age. Maybe you can't get a SIM card because you don't have an ID card. Members of a particular community can't get benefits. And then when we look at these policy issues, begin to how to look to remove the barriers that the requirement for ID often throws up. And because these are often kind of artificial, man-made barriers in place, which often aren't needed. Like when you look at, say, the need to have an ID to have a SIM card, a huge impact on people's ability to communicate freely, but something which is shown not to have an impact on criminality. So that is things we can do away with. And so, we need to tackle these all these areas, these barriers, and see, how can we make things easier? Because some people are going to struggle to have access to digital ID. It will exclude some people. How can we remove the ID barriers rather than saying, okay, a digital ID will cut across and solve all these kind of issues? And so in the debates more generally, there's so much over what a system should look like, all these kind of questions, and so much less over why it is needed at all. Because after all, the purpose of the system that determines what it will look like technically, and it's a purpose that justifies existence in terms of both data protection and also human rights.
Thanks, Tom. That's a really helpful framing there. And Anri, would love to now turn to you just to think about how these systems have been deployed in the global south, what we can learn from other systems like this that have been deployed in the past.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Tom, for that very interesting introduction to this. And I should just say that I can't really speak for the global south as a whole. I am South African and I can speak for the South African context and to some extent the African context, but it is really complex and really interesting. And I think adding to what Tom says, that's probably one of the first lessons is that with digital ID systems and the rollout thereof, we need to start putting people more at the center and meeting real needs on the ground rather than proposing these sort of one-size-fits-all approaches, which we see in a lot of contexts like the African context. If I can take a step back, I'll explain that the organization that I work with, Research ICT Africa, has been doing research on ICT policy and access for the past 10, 15 years. And for a long time, we've been looking at how people access and use various technologies, and specifically information and communication technologies. We've done household access and use surveys where we look at how people, for instance, gain access to the internet and what are the barriers to access, etc. And so we've got our experience is more in understanding the sort of these barriers and policy problems in the African context. And we find it quite interesting that increasingly we are being pushed towards the sort of digital ID, and also because in a lot of countries, digital ID used to sit with departments or ministries of home affairs, and increasingly is moving towards more sort of departments of communication, which is an interesting sort of shift in itself. And we've seen that in South Africa, for instance. And, you know, so increasingly we're realizing that we do need to be aware of what's happening around it. And as, you know, digital ID becomes more central to whether it's COVID-19 relief programs or other sorts of things, the risks of exclusion become bigger and bigger. And at RIA, we have this phrase that we often use, the digital inequality paradox, which basically means that as digital inclusion around the world is increasing, and we have higher levels of internet access and other access to technologies, we see inequality increasing too. And it's kind of the opposite of what we expected, and the opposite of what the UN and other people tend to tell us will happen when we promote internet access and access to technologies, including digital ID. And that's a bit of a really tricky policy problem. And I think digital ID struggles from the same thing. As we are increasingly reliant on digital technologies, including digital ID, the risk of not participating in these regimes become bigger and bigger, and your exclusion becomes a bigger problem. So this is partly why we partnered with Amber's organization, the Center for Internet and Society, and tried to use an evaluation framework, which they designed initially to test the Aadhaar system in India, and tried to test that in an African context. And I think Amber will speak more about that, and I won't steal his thunder. But basically, we looked at 10 African countries. We got local partners in each of those countries to assess the state of digital ID in these countries. So countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And I think while the findings are preliminary because the research is still ongoing, I can say a few broad things. And I think, some of the interesting points, at least to us, have been the similarities across these contexts that often have colonial roots in how the digital ID systems come about. If you look at, for instance, the South African context and a very fraught history with surveillance technologies around the apartheid state and how biometric ID systems were used around the Dompas. Similarly, in Kenya, you have the history of what they called Kitange, also British colonial sort of roots. And it's actually really ironic that a lot of our governments and UN organizations, etc., are proposing digital ID solutions for various problems and bureaucratic inefficiencies, etc., because of these roots. And often they don't interrogate these roots and try to understand where they're coming from, and a lot of these systems come from. And there's a South African academic called Keith Breckenridge, who writes brilliantly about this, about the South African system around biometric ID, developed about 100 years ago, and how that's been exported and implemented in countries like India and the rest of the global South. Now, the difference between the global South and the global North in this context is there's similar developments around biometric ID and digital ID, but in the global North, typically we have much more deliberation around these things than we have in the global South. And that for me has been one of the most interesting findings, preliminary findings from our country partners, is that often they really struggle to find the data and any kind of publications around what's happening in their context. So Amber will explain how the evaluation framework works, but basically there's certain questions that they have to find answers or documents or policies in response to, and they simply can't find that data in that document. So there's a lack of transparency around what's happening and how it's happening, etc. At the same time, you have a lot of different institutions in play. So you have this sort of the Chinese state, and then you've got the World Bank and a lot of actors kind of, almost operating in this tug of war over the continent to some extent. And you can understand why. To some extent, there are fears of what China is doing around surveillance technologies in countries like Zimbabwe. And then you've got the World Bank and other sort of UN type organizations trying to propose a more Western ideal of digital ID. So you've got that. And then you've got this very interesting melange of different actors. And Kelly, you also mentioned this, how the vendor selection happens, etc. And a lot of interesting public-private partnerships, again, often quite opaque and very little oversight over who's supplying the technology, how it's working, who's designing it, where is it being designed, and what's happening to the data, how it's being extracted or not. And that's where concepts like data colonialism become quite interesting. I think broadly speaking, you asked me whether there are questions that we can draw upon from other digital technologies. I think if anything, one of the most interesting things for me is the difficulty of understanding risks and harms. And I've mentioned this to Amber too. I think it's a shortcoming that we have in digital technology broadly, and understanding digital technology, in that we often don't understand risks and how they play out. And people and even policymakers tend to conflate risk with harm. And you see that in countries even like the UK, where we have an online harms white paper trying to regulate online challenges from child online protection to privacy online. But harm isn't the same as risk. And I think to some extent, some risk sometimes is a good thing. And often these two are conflated. And that's something that we often see in this space around digital ID as well, is that we conflate the risk of certain things happening with the actual harm of it. And it is a very careful sort of tightrope between the two. And yes, I think, so that's one problem. I think the other one is, you mentioned the statistics around GDP and increases to GDP, that completely neglects the sort of other human development aspects. And these things are also common to, when you look at access to the internet. People often say if you gain 1% more people access to broadband, you'll have so much growth in your GDP. But it doesn't look at the problems that come with digital access, etc. And I think the same thing for digital ID. I'll stop there, but I'll take some questions after. Thank you.
Anri, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And Amber, I would love to turn to you. You have done such thoughtful work on determining how we should assess these systems, and so would love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Kelly. I think I'll just take off from some of the threads that have already been touched upon by Tom and Anri. But before that, I think one thing that I wanted to highlight was even the term that we use, digital ID system, that plays a role in the narrative around that. Essentially, what these systems are not identity systems; they are identification systems. And the key fundamental problem that they're trying to solve is that of trust. Is that as an individual, how do I prove that I am who I claim to be? That has very little to do with the idea of identity. And when we talk of digital ID as a tool of empowerment, or something that makes people feel that they belong to a certain community or within the state because it gives them identity, that there is a kind of false equivalence that we are drawing in conflating identification with identity. So I think that's something about the sort of terminology and the narrative that I wanted to highlight right at the outset. I think Tom mentioned the word silver bullet, and I think Anri in the beginning spoke about the idea of ID systems as the sort of one size fits all solution. And that is something that we've looked at in quite a bit of detail. First, if we are thinking of a digital identity system, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? In India, we started the conversation with the problem of leakages, for instance, in the social delivery sector, in the PDS and ration sector. There was a problem of a lot of leakages, and for instance, the food subsidies would not reach the appropriate beneficiary. And the assumption that we began with is that the problem is right at the last mile of delivery, because there are bogus or ghost card holders, and that relates to some kind of black market of beneficiaries. Whereas most research has indicated that the problem exists actually somewhere in the midway point between the state and the citizen, and there are other kinds of leakages. And there may be other forms of digital technological solutions, like, for instance, putting a GPS detector in the vehicles which carry the Russians, rather than investing so much money in creating a digital ID solution for a billion and a quarter citizens. So I think the first thing that we have to begin with, what is the problem that we want to solve with ID system, and in what ways does the design of the ID system actually lead to that problem being solved? And largely what we see emerging is digital identity system very much at the center of particularly nationally issued identity systems, largely at the center of the plethora of initiatives around digital and e-governance that the state is investing in. And that is very much central to the idea of the sort of welfare agenda or the development agenda of several states in the global south. And that is also something that needs to be interrogated a little more closely. What digital identity does ensure is that if you have one unique identifiers that you have to use across the board for both private as well as public sector providers that you interact with, it does lead to immense risks of profiling. So you have, in fact, policy documents in India call it cradle to grave mapping of an individual, or within the healthcare system we talk about it as cradle to grave health history of an individual. So and I think there was something that Anri touched upon in terms of the difference between the North and the South, and that's part of our evaluation framework. The first part of our evaluation framework deals with tests, which we call the rule of law tests, and there the absence of robust regulations, whether it is in the form of data protection regulation, whether it is in the form of clear rules around legislative mandate and delegated legislation, those are found to be wanting in several global south contexts, and that plays a huge role in how a digital ID system might develop. Because the other thing that we need to remember is by definition, a digital identity system is more privacy restricting than its analog cousin that it is seeking to replace. Because the idea is that the system by itself would lead to more personal data generation and collection of that personal data. And when we are looking at additional restrictions on privacy, then we have to interrogate with whether it satisfies the tests of necessity and proportionality or not. And that sort of interrogation, that sort of analysis at the, as part of the feasibility testing itself is not something that we see largely. There is widespread reliance on some research available in a few countries around the accuracy of the biometrics itself, and that has led to humongous problems around inclusion. The state of technology itself, the access to technology, and the state of sort of internet connectivity in various parts of the country are often not taken very well into consideration. And these are again problems, like Anri was mentioning, that we see across contexts, across various countries that we have looked at. And again, the other problems that I mentioned, lack of legislative mandate, lack of a robust data protection frameworks. It was actually quite staggering just in terms of the commonality of problems that we experienced across various contexts and countries. The other thing that I want to highlight is that when we are thinking of the design of ID system, within the chat, I saw a few questions about zero trust approaches and decentralized and self-sovereign ideas. So the other unfortunate thing is that the design and conception of ID systems as they exist currently is still largely driven by a handful of vendor companies. And that vision is also, to a large extent, if I believe my technologist friends, out of touch with the state of technology that exists. So the state of tech might allow for certain use cases which might be more privacy preserving. So for instance, the British researcher Dave Birch talks about the idea of of a psychic ID, where if you are going to a bar, a digital ID solution might be able to be designed in a way that you don't need to share all your information. You only need to share whether you're above 18 years of age or above drinking age or not. But more and more, what we see is the design of the systems are not intended to minimize the amount of data that you share, but actually maximize it in one way or the other. So most of these solutions, and particularly solutions around decentralization of ID, are not something that either nation states or vendor companies are often interested in exploring in any real way. And to some extent, it's also a state failure in being able to actually understand the capacity challenges in being able to demand better of vendor companies who are serving them, which is something that we need to look at very closely. The final thing I wanted to touch upon was this whole issue of risk and harm that Anri touched upon. And a lot of critique of emerging digital ID systems is often dismissed as trying to paint sort of dystopian technological picture of things, which are not yet in existence. But it is at the inception stage that those questions must be asked. So when we think of risk assessment of digital ID system, we have to look at both the probability of a risk event occurring and also the severity of that possible risk event. So for instance, in India, where we have a centralized repository of biometrics of over 1 billion citizens of our country, even if, assuming that the most state-of-the-art cybersecurity solutions are in place, such that the probability of a risk event of, for instance, a cyber breach is very, very remote. But it's not going to be zero. And in case that there is a breach, the severity of the risk is so high, because if you are if biometrics of more than 1 billion citizens are compromised, these are not like credit card numbers that can be reissued. These are irreversible forms of harms. So I think it is from this risk assessment perspective that we need to also view critiques of digital ID systems, which are dismissed as being Luddite often, and looked at within the entire sort of scope and design of the project. And I'll pause now, and hopefully we'll see a lot of questions and engagement around this issue in the next few minutes.
Great, Amber, thank you so much. And a number of interesting questions that have come up in the chat box. And if others have questions, please go ahead and add those. I want to start with one that a number of people seem to be interested in and pose it. It was directed at Tom, and want to start, Tom, with you, but pose it to sort of everyone here. And Tom, I think you had I think we began this conversation with how can these best be implemented? And you raised the question up a level to sort of say, should they even be implemented at all? And would love to hear each of your thoughts on, not just how it's done, but whether it should be done at all. And this is the question was framed in the context of other identifiers in the private sector, Gmail, phone numbers, things like that, which end up serving as proxy identifiers and are even more thinly legally protected. So this question, and I would add to that, even questions about in the United States, Social Security cards and numbers that are sort of easily lost and misplaced and so forth. So I would be curious your thoughts on whether these systems should exist, how they compare to other systems, because there will be some kind of identification system necessary. And I think the last part of the question that was posed here was thoughts on the ability to participate economically in a digital world without these kinds of systems. So Tom, I want to start with you, and then would love to hear others' thoughts on whether we should have these systems at all compared to other ID systems.
There's quite a broad range of issues there. I mean, I think I wouldn't be necessarily opposed to having national digital ID systems, and there can definitely be a role for government in the development and deployment of these. I think the problem is particularly in the African context, or to other parts of the world, where it's only kind of one model, the ADA model, or Estonian models are then are the ones which are pushed and proposed, which come with whole sets of risks and dangers. Other kind of setups, trust frameworks, roles of various kind of identity providers whether we have to have kind of a unique identity for every, for every person, or any kind of biometrics involved. Those are things that we can question, and those are kind of the things we should debate. I think Privacy International is very concerned with these other forms of ID, which very much ties to how you're tracked across the internet, through your browser, through your phone, and all these kind of setups. And I think really, it's really important to note that these plus social security numbers, they can be an attempt to do kind of digital ID on the cheap, when in fact they really are inadequate for this this task, because people might not have them at all, they might be sharing them, all these other kind of factors involved there. So it just shows the danger of these these ways in which people are trying to identify you, but across and track you to serve advertising, but also increasingly to manipulate us politically, to how we vote, to gather more and more data about us, which is a huge set of concerns. On the final point about economic participation, I think as we've seen around the world, there's not kind of one model for what that economic participation looks like. And if you see how you can get things ordered online, paying cash in various contexts, these kind of things, and the initiatives from kind of local level access to the digital economy. It's not just about having this kind of digital identity, and so much of that push for the need to have that digital identity to participate in the economy comes from rules surrounding know your customer, anti-money laundering, all these sets of rules, which is another powerful set of actors imposed from above, from the Financial Action Task Force and other international players. And that's also something we have to, with that international set of pressures on countries to introduce these kind of measures, when in fact they come with so many risks for exclusion, surveillance, and all the other things we've highlighted.
Thank you, Tom. And Anri, Amber, any other thoughts on these deployments vis-a-vis other kinds of identification systems? And I think worth noting that there's something like 30 countries by my count that already have deployed some kind of a digital ID system. So certainly these are going to be happening, and this question about how they compare to other kinds of systems and how they enable economic participation.
Thanks, Kelly. I can pick it up from there. I think, unfortunately, I don't think this is now a question of whether we should have these systems. I think it's how we have these systems increasingly. I mean, at the moment, the African Union Commission has just launched a process to draft a digital ID policy framework for the continent. And I think that kind of system is likely to be focused more on the sort of financial implications and supporting digital economies rather than the citizenship and migration elements of digital ID, which I don't think necessarily is a great approach, because that's not really meeting the needs that they have on the continent. And again, it comes to what Tom was saying around not wanting a one size fits all, not necessarily wanting something that's designed in Silicon Valley or DC or Beijing, wherever it be, but rather having something that meets a need on the ground, and whether that's complex and complicating and political, that it's going to be, but we also need to grapple with those issues and actually understand where it's coming from. And that's why I emphasize the history of these systems. I think you asked how we can do it better. I think acknowledging that one size fits all doesn't work, as Tom was saying, much more consultation and public participation in these processes. That's a first step. I think Tom's organization does a lot of work on understanding data protection frameworks on the continent. And I think last year put out this great paper around the lack of them. And until we don't have these relevant data protection and broader data governance frameworks on the continent, it's really difficult to implement the systems and do that well. And then again, if you don't have the institutions that support the governance frameworks, it doesn't really help that you have these great laws. And that's often the problem in countries like South Africa, where you have great laws, but you don't have resources to implement. One example is the information regulator in South Africa, which is a great institution, but has something like 10 people max working for it, and it has a massive mandate to deal with data and information. It's impossible for it to do it well, basically. Amber mentioned risk assessments, and I agree, and maybe that's also where we can be a little bit more positive, because these systems are designed. There is an opportunity to change them, but again, that comes down to actually having conversations about what people want on the continent and in the global south, rather than just imposing whether it's a World Bank or a other view on people, but actually meeting those needs. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anri. Amber, anything you would add there? Or I have 4 or 5 other questions we can move to.
Just one, I think, quick point about the sort of how versus why question that Anri also touched upon. And I think Tom raised the more fundamental question that we should be asking about why do we need digital ID in the first place in a particular context. And I agree with Anri that I think, for instance, in India, for the last decade, we've kind of had the why discourse. And we've had sort of ongoing litigation for the past decade, and it hasn't really led to significant change. It's led to some changes in terms of the design of the system and introduction of a few protections, but it hasn't led to significant change. And a lot of our work now is focused on the how question, because I think in the UK, for instance, one was able to push back against the idea of a centralized national ID system, and that movement was successful. But we see such examples few and far in between across countries. So I think that as more and more ID systems are emerging, I think a lot of focus also needs to be on the how question, because so that we are able to ask these and demand better from the ID system right from the outset itself.
Great, thank you, Amber. So a couple of questions have come up about sort of zero trust, and then questions have been added on to that around blockchain, and really all circling around this question of the security and the privacy of these systems and the risks imposed there. Does anyone here have a perspective on how to maximize the security of these systems, and if there are any sort of creative opportunities that are being missed here?
I mean, I'll add one point there. I think the key challenge that we face in a lot of countries is the cost question. The reason why the biggest argument for this sort of paper-based yet kind of digital centralized biometric ID system in India was the cost efficiency aspect of it. Some of my colleagues in the past who argued for a smart card-based ID where you have data stored on the card itself as opposed to in a centralized repository, that obviously comes with significant cost implications. And I think that's the technological challenge that we are facing, how to solve the privacy question while making it cost effective, particularly in country where we might be able to afford per ID kind of cost at a fairly low scale. The other, I think, issue there is also so the primary reason why a central repository, for instance, which creates the maximum amount of privacy risk, has been argued is in order to do some manner of deduplication, because you need to, there seems to be an assumption that there is an epidemic of identity fraud going around, and we need to address that. I think the one kind of easy step that can be taken is that in such cases, we don't use biometrics for authentication at all. If that's your primary argument that you need to use it for deduplication, then it must be restricted to that, and there should be other forms of technology, whether it's OTP or whatever, that are used for authentication-based system. And then the second issue that I see is because we're talking about a unique ID that is attached to an individual. How do we minimize the profiling risks? And that's the other huge privacy risk, because if that is the one number that gets tied to pretty much all manners of behavior and all manners of interactions that you have, both with private and public bodies, there I think having interoperable systems where even if you have some form of foundational ID, you might be able to make it communicate in a privacy-preserving way with functional ID, so that you're able to minimize the amount of data that is collected around one number. I think those are key technological problems that we do need to solve.
Thank you. I really appreciate that last point. Okay, a few other questions. And since we were talking about, vendors and the cost overall of these systems and the challenges that poses for security, there was a question around the role of vendors versus the role of government and the role of sort of transparency in helping sort of maximize accountability of vendors. What are your perspectives on how to manage what I think is a very real challenge of potentially, locking in vendors who are not necessarily the best ones to be doing the work, or in developing countries, other sets of challenges in the procurement process that can be really difficult?
I can get going on that or Tom. I think especially during COVID-19 and seeing countries try and respond to it, we've seen really interesting examples around this. And in the global south, I think especially this is the case where you have governments that often lack this sort of resources to roll out certain things, and that comes with the problem around accountability. And I think one example was in South Africa when government tried to roll out certain COVID-19 relief grants and ended up partnering with local private sector to use WhatsApp in order to get people to register and then get access to a very minimal loan. And the interesting thing is that this provider ended up taking WhatsApp or Facebook to court because WhatsApp threatened to deplatform them because they were using this as a commercial service without getting permission from Facebook first. So I think that it was quite a nice example of how these public-private interplays can sometimes also sort of have unintended consequences that, I think we always see it from the sort of the problem of service delivery being actually public sector responsibility, and then private sector steps in and you don't have the relevant safeguards that you would have if the public sector actually delivers on their mandate and being elected. But this example kind of provided this extra layer of complexity when you have this organization sitting in Silicon Valley or wherever, then want to start compete with a local provider, because that's effectively what it was, in order to also deliver these kinds of services. But I think, again, the point that we raised before around transparency of public-private partnerships, and it's the same whether it's a cybersecurity strategy or a digital ID solution, is always going to be key, but very difficult in contexts like the Global South, where you lack public sector capacity to roll these things out.
Yeah, thank you, Anri. Anything that folks would want to add to that? Or I'd love to move to a question about the role of China here in exporting some of these technologies and otherwise.
Just very quickly, I think the vendors have a very close kind of relationship with the nation state actors in a lot of this, and they're really not just kind of selling. They're not just kind of offering a product that they might want to buy. They are key proponents of the spread of these technologies that they're selling across the world. And we really have to understand that they have their own set of commercial interests. They want digital ID to be used for more and more sets of things, so that it's used more, so that there's potential for more kind of sets of profits there. So while the private sector has a key role in these kind of systems, and and many excellent forms of digital ID have private sector playing a really important role, we do have to recognise what they want, what they are pushing for is more digital identity, and keep them in the area where we can kind of make use of their expertise, buy their products and things. But that kind of the broader complete policy discussion has to have that broader range of actors involved, particularly civil society, which is so often just cut out from all of these debates.
Thank you, Tom. So I now wanted to turn to, and Anri, appreciated that you answered part of this question in the chat, but this question about the role of China and Chinese companies here in exporting some of these technologies or in influencing the use of these technologies in the Global South, particularly in Africa, and a question about how Western institutions and Western sort of principles around governance of these technologies might help to influence that process. And I think we see this in a number of cases of the sort of global debate between democracy and authoritarianism often playing out in the use of these technologies and their deployment. So any thoughts on how the Western sort of democratic model versus the Chinese model is influencing the deployment in other countries?
I could get started, but I don't really have the answer to this one. Mm-hmm. I think it is really interesting geopolitically that you are sitting with a situation, and it's similar in other digital policy areas where it does seem to be a little bit of a West versus rest issue, and we see the same in internet governance. But I think Tom mentioned vendors. I think a lot of people have agendas in this space, increasing a lot of the international aid agencies working on the continent, also pushing for certain, and whether that is to keep China out or whether it is, because they really genuinely care about development and growing GDP, etc. It still is an agenda that's not really being consulted on the continent. And I think what we would really like to see is really an African agenda on these issues rather than a Western agenda being opposed without local sort of participation and development. Because, frankly, there are really a lot of very interesting, conceptual understandings of ID that we could draw upon. Like the African understanding of, for instance, privacy, which is much more often communal than the Western one, which is typically much more individual already. That's, really interesting things that people could be drawing on. And instead, what's happening is you seeing, World Bank and other types of organizations come in and impose a model which, yes, works elsewhere, but it hasn't really been tested. So I don't particularly have a view about which model is better. Obviously, one would assume one that is more autocratic and that copies the sort of social credit system, scoring system that the Chinese use is potentially very problematic. But I also think that the Western model comes with a lot of problems, especially if it is rolled out by a lot of the big tech organizations that tend to be involved in these conversations.
Yeah. Thank you, Anri. I think that, I'm sorry, did you have something that you wanted to add, Amber?
I think on the sort of question around on the role of various geopolitical actors around digital ID, it's actually quite interesting because for the better part of the last 2 decades, we've had a handful of large vendor companies or conglomerates, mostly based in the West. What we see emerging in the last few years is there are actors, for instance, interested in the export of Aadhaar. There are actors very much interested in the export of the very peculiar Estonian model, which also, and both of them have seen recipients, across different geographies. The Chinese model, I think from what I understand of some of these kind of convenings, there's been a lot of facial recognition technology that emerged from China in the last few years, and I think particularly they also emerged as in competition to the sort of biometric fingerprint Aadhaar model that was being exported from India. And I think to some extent the backlash against facial recognition technologies in various parts of the world might have thwarted that to some extent, but I do expect to see a lot of adoption of that technology in the next decade in various parts of the world. The sort of the question about Western actors being able to sort of thwart that or balance that. I think that's a more complicated issue. A lot of Western actors, like Anri mentioned, have been involved in it with their own agendas, their own sort of profit margins at play. And it is essentially a competition between various kinds of actors in the business of creating surveillance technology. And there is sort of narrative built around that surveillance technology. I think which might vary, and in some cases, perhaps some of the protections will also vary. But I think what we need to question is, as we see adoption of these technologies, or the question of adoption of these technologies, what are the key questions that we do need to ask right at the outset before we get there, so rather than seeing it as kind of having to choose amongst a sort of scale of surveillance technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Amber, for that. And so a last question. We have about 5 minutes left. I want to save 1 minute for next steps. So a lightning round, but touching on what both of you had said, and a question in the chat box around assessment and metrics. And if you were to think of just two, and recognizing and appreciating, Tom, your point early on of these systems are being used to do just about everything. So there are sort of thousands of sub-questions built in. But is there any kind of a consensus or a strong view on any of your parts about how would you, and Amber, it kind of maps to your question of asking some of these questions up front before these systems are deployed, how would you assess what are, just one or two metrics, three metrics versus the many, Tom, that I could imagine, based on different use cases that you guys, but one or two metrics that you would recommend?
I'm going to suggest CIS, Amber's organization's evaluation framework, which really is at least a very good starting point for assessing digital ID systems.
Yes, I was thinking, Amber, we might start with you on this one. And if there are even just a couple within that framework that you would prioritize, recognizing that that's a hard question to answer.
I mean, I think there is a lot of attention that we are paying to the rights question, but I think what we need to start asking right at the outset is about the design of the systems itself. What are the big kind of problems that they're intended to solve? And what features about the technological design of the ID system right from the outset, rather than governance measures and legal measures coming in place to actually address problems of technology. How do we design the technology right from the outset that it is actually geared towards an inclusive, privacy-preserving ID system? I think, again, those are not specific points, a much more broader general point, but I think that approach is what I would advocate.
Thank you, Amber. And I think it'd be great if you haven't, I don't believe you've already put a link to your report in the chat, but I think that would be great for the audience to have access to that. Okay, 1 minute left for lightning.
Just to quickly add on that, sorry.
Sure.
What we need for any of these metrics is that if a state is making a claim, say this ID system will reduce fraud, we need that baseline study of what the level of fraud is before the system is introduced. Otherwise, they make claims further down the road without any basis. So those kind of metrics are extremely important.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And okay, lightning round of last, any final thoughts, burning comments that any of you want to make before we lose you all? No? All right. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it. It is such a timely and important conversation, and I appreciate the chance to learn from all of you here. So thank you for that. I will turn now just very quickly to next steps. We are going to be hosting another webinar actually tomorrow. Nate Pursley, who's the faculty co-director at the Cyber Policy Center, and the policy director, Marita Schake, will be joined by colleagues from the German embassy, from the think tank R Street in DC, and from Facebook to talk about strengthening democracies in the digital age. So hope you all can join us then. And then we'll be taking a little bit of a summer break in July and August and coming back in September with more webinars then. So we will send that out as we get those scheduled. So again, thank you everyone today for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it, especially recognizing that you are in London and India and not in the best time zones to be doing calls. So thank you so much for that, and take care.